Friday, the 11th of July. And what do we have? Well, we have an internationally recognised terrorist being welcomed as the new head of state for Syria. We have an internationally recognised war criminal, at least by the International Criminal Court of Justice, dining in the White House. And we have the full weight of American sanctions being applied against an individual woman for the heinous crime of simply telling the truth. I'm Bintang Bernie, and this is Friday News Review. So, Syria apparently has a new president, but just exactly who is Abu Muhammad al-Jalani? Interestingly enough, his name translates as one who comes from the Golan Heights. And as we know, the Golan Heights has been under the occupation of Israel since the 1967 Six-Day War. And it's also interesting that there is clear evidence that Israel at various times gave assistance to Islamist groups fighting in Syria and Iraq because it suited the overall goals of the Israeli government, the long-standing Yinon plan, which aims to break up or balkanize the Middle East into small regional areas, which Israel can then conquer one by one as part of the plan for a greater Israel. So we have to be very skeptical as to the background of this man. He was a fighter in Iraq, and then in 2011, when the Syrian civil war broke out, he moved into Syria and founded the al-Nusra Front. Now, just a quick aside on the Syrian civil war, or so-called civil war. This wasn't really a populist uprising against an evil dictator in Bashar al-Assad, as it's presented to you in the Western media. This was actually the work of MI6 and CIA, deliberately sowing discontent and working with the various factions in Syria to create a revolution. You see, Syria, like most of the Middle East, was a map drawn on a line by the Brits, and it encompasses a very disparate group of peoples and religions who, in Syria's case, were managing to live together relatively harmoniously. The problem was, you see, that the Americans were intent at that time in destroying Russia's economy. I always think it's funny how people think things like, for example, the war in Ukraine, how they're isolated incidents. These are not isolated incidents. They're part of a long-standing chain of events. You see, when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1990 and 1991, the Americans and the Western companies went into Russia and basically raped it of its resources. Then, unfortunately, a guy called Vladimir Putin came to power, and he kicked a lot of those companies out. Ever since, the United States has been hell-bent on destroying Russia's economy and breaking it economically. And we have evidence of this. We know that when the sanctions were imposed on Russia at the start of the actual intervention by Russia in Ukraine, that the announcement was made that we're going to turn the ruble into rubble. Of course, exactly the opposite has happened. But going back to Syria, what the aim was to pump gas from the North Fars gas field, which at the time was the largest gas field in the world, still may be, and to pump it through a pipeline going through Syria, into Turkey, and thence into Europe. The idea behind this was to stop the European dependence on Russian gas. Europe, for decades, has received cheap oil and gas from Russia. And Russia's economy was built around these gas and oil exports. And Europe, of course, was then dependent on Russia. So the idea was that you could negate Russia's influence in Europe, cripple its economy by stopping its gas exports, by pumping this gas all the way from basically the Iranian coastline through to Europe. The problem was that Bashar al-Assad, who was friendly with Russia, refused to allow the pipeline to go through Syria. Once again, fatal flaw. And as such, he had to be toppled. The fact that in toppling him thousands upon thousands of innocent civilians were slaughtered and brutally murdered was, of course, of little consequence to the powers that be. Then we had, of course, Obama designating these groups in Syria, which we had set up as the most Orwellian phrase I've ever heard, moderate rebels. Do you think these guys are moderate? Remember poor 12-year-old Abdullah Issa, who was cajoled with these so-called moderate rebels and, chatted to, talked to, and then taken out into the street and had his head cut off with a knife. They're the kind of people that Barack Obama wants you to believe are moderate. They're the kind of people that Barack Obama dropped arms and munitions to assist. These are the kind of people, this is the stock that al-Jilani comes from. Al-Nusra Front was designated a moderate terrorist group, and we inundated them with weapons. Ironically, al-Jilani himself was designated as a terrorist leader by the US State Department with a $10 million bounty on his head. Now look at that. Isn't that interesting? Here is a poster telling you that this guy, you'll get $10 million if you tell the State Department where he is so he can be arrested. And now, all of a sudden, here he is shaking hands with Donald Trump and being feted as the new ruler of Syria, trying to legitimize this person. Let's look a little bit back at the history of Al-Nusra Front, the organization that Jilani founded and led. An Amnesty report, I'm going to quote from this. In 2016, Amnesty International did a report on Al-Nusra, and they found that they were guilty of torture, child abduction, and summary execution. This is our new friend in Syria. The report stated that in 2014, the Al-Nusra fighters abducted a woman, accused her of adultery, and executed her by shooting her in the back of the head. Lovely people. In 2015, they went into a village, a Druze village, Druze being one of the many offshoot religions in the area. And they wanted just to appropriate one of the villagers' houses. We're going to take a house. The guy objected. So in consequence, they took 20 of the local villagers outside, lined them up, and shot them all. Al-Jilani's mob. As of June 2013, Al-Nusra, okay, get this, out of at that stage, there had been 70 suicide bombing suicide bombs in Syria. Al-Jilani's group claimed responsibility for 57 of those groups, of those suicide attacks. Amnesty's report states, and I quote, overall, they have applied a strict interpretation of Sharia and imposed punishments amounting to torture or other ill treatment for perceived infractions of the law. It's worth noting that al-Nusra's stated objective, was to establish an Islamic state in Syria under Sharia law. Now, these are the people that we've supported, we have armed, and we are now welcoming onto the world stage. And well, from one terrorist to another. Yes, that statesman for slaughter, the Governor of Genocide, Benjamin Netanyahu, is dining in the White House. Of course, when Mr. Netanyahu arrived in the United States, he wasn't arrested because the United States doesn't recognize the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court. It always makes me ironically laugh that the West, where we bang on so often about the rules-based order, okay, and as I've often said on this program, a set of rules that nobody's seen, no one has written, and certainly nobody's agreed to. But we go on about how the rules-based order is so important, and yet when an international criminal court issues an arrest warrant, we simply turn around and go, well, we don't agree with that. We don't recognize it. So the rules-based order is basically about everyone applying their own rules. There is no international rules-based order. There is actually no international consensus. Oh, there's the UN Charter, things like the UN Charter of Human Rights and the UN Charter itself. But of course, people just refuse to recognize various parts of it, don't agree to it. So in terms of, we talk about the international order, there is no international order. Countries will always do what is in the interest of the country itself. They won't work harmoniously in the interests of any kind of world organization. So yes, we have Netanyahu being feted in the White House. This is a man whose government has embarked on what is clearly nothing other than ethnic cleansing of an indigenous population. I have to laugh. Zionists keep talking about how, their history. Israel is the only country in the world with a 3,000-year history that began in 1948. The original tribes of Judea have scattered. The remnants of them always lived in Palestine, stayed there with the Arabs who had been there for 3,000 years and plus. Remember, the Middle East is an Arabic area. The Arabs have a history there that goes back thousands of years. The Palestinians who live there are indigenous to the region. The Zionists who came there in 1948 are not. They're a colonial enterprise. These are Europeans. These Zionists, most of them were born in places like Poland. They came and they established a colonial enclave, and since then have been desperately trying to destroy any semblance of ownership by the indigenous people, and have been engaged in ethnic cleansing, and that's what's happening right now in Israel. Mark my words, Benjamin Netanyahu will go down in the annals of history alongside people like Adolf Hitler. He is an evil, horrible man in charge of an evil, horrible country. Lately, the Israeli government has been removing baby formula from anyone arriving in Israel who attempts to go to Gaza. Do you know why they're doing that? Because the mothers giving birth in Gaza, having been starved with 3 months of no aid being allowed in by Israel, by Netanyahu, these women are starving and as such can't breastfeed their babies when they give birth. So the only option for them is to use baby formula. So the Israeli government is confiscating baby formula in a deliberate attempt to starve newborn babies to death. These are the people that want our support and sadly get it. These are the people that my government and yours stands behind. These are the people that claim to have the most moral army in the world. Since Israel has set up its aid distribution points. Now this comes from Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper. So as I've said before on this program, I often quote statistics or information from Haaretz because you can't dispute, that's Israel's own newspaper telling you that we now know that it has come out that Israeli soldiers were given orders to shoot and kill civilians at these aid distribution sites. So what happened to this great lie that they kept perpetrating about they're defending themselves from attack? This war is all about self-defense. Well, when you're shooting unarmed civilians who are starving and queuing up for aid, you're not defending yourself, you're committing war crimes. Now, the Gaza Health Ministry, as reported by Haaretz, has said that 549 civilians, Gazan civilians, all Arabs, by the way, don't get under any misconception. This is a racially motivated crime by Israeli racists. 549 Gazans have been killed and 4,000 have been wounded. People simply queuing up for aid because they're living in an area where the Israelis have bombed, slaughtered everyone, destroyed all of the infrastructure and refused to let aid come in. And this is what's been going on. We had the testimony in Haaretz of a young Israeli soldier saying that in his area, between 1 and 5 civilians were shot each day. He described it as a killing field. Apparently the order comes from a guy called a Brigadier General Yehuda Vash, who's a regional IDF commander and who's been given the order to soldiers to shoot these people. And we know the involvement by American contractors. What is going on there is appalling. And meanwhile, the man who's in charge of it all, the man who's responsible for this, is being dined in the White House. And of course, what has our government got to say about it here in Australia? Absolutely nothing. Timid little quiet rats hiding under the table, a lot of them. I wrote a submission to Parliament back when Foreign Minister Penny Neverwong, she ceased the Australian funding to UNRWA, the United Nations Refugee Agency, Relief Works Agency, which was providing food and medicine in Gaza. And my submission was to demand as to what information she'd received that caused her to stop the Australian funding, because it was predicated on Israel's claim that UNRWA had several terrorists working under its auspices who were responsible or had taken part in the October 7 attack on Israel. Like everything, Israel provided no evidence. It never does. Israel is a state that continually lies. Beheaded babies, rape victims, torture. We all know that's been debunked. It's been lies. It's total lies. So the submission that was read out in Parliament by Maureen Faruqi, who unfortunately made a complete fuck up of it and absolutely came across as incompetent and stupid because she started changing the wording. The wording was quite simple, asking Penny Wong, what information did you get that UNRWA was employing these so-called terrorists? Where did you fact check it? Mm-hmm. Did you consider this information? Did you assess it properly? Okay. Was it verified independently by the Australian government? Where did it come from? And of course, we know the answer was it came from Israel. And the minute Israel jumped, just like every other country around us, whenever anyone tells us to do something, we doff our hats and go yes straight away. I never expected, of course, Penny Wong to answer any of those questions, because it always amazes me in democracies like ours where governments just refuse to tell you what goes on. I always find democracy such a double-sided sword. I have to admit, it's the best system that we have at the moment, but it is so open to corruption and to misuse. And as Bintang always says, the danger with democracy is it gives a whole lot of people a chance to have a say in matters of which they know very little about. But Western democracies bang on as though we're some great, wonderful thing. And then you have instances where, a minister like that will just refuse to give you information. In a true functioning democracy, everything should be in the public domain. As I always say, democracy is not about having the right to vote. It's an important part of it. It's one of the founding tenets of democracy. But it's not what democracy is about. Democracy is about being able to hold your government to account. And if you cannot hold your government to account, then you're not living in a democracy. You're in effect living in a limited tenure dictatorship. And that's what most Western democracies are. We vote governments in, they do whatever the hell they want. We have very little say and no influence in what they do for those years that they're in office. And then we either vote them out or vote them back in. Anyway, going back to the original point, that our government has said nothing about the fact that a war criminal is being entertained in the White House. And at the same time, Marco Rubio has announced that the United States will impose sanctions on Francesca Albanese, who did nothing other than tell the truth. But then again, looking at Julian Assange, it seems our government's quite complicit in allowing people who do nothing other than tell the truth to be imprisoned, to be persecuted, and to be victimised. Poor Francesca Albanese is an Italian lawyer, and she was the special rapporteur for the UN on Gaza. And all she did was she published a list of companies who are profiting from the genocide in Gaza. Companies that are manufacturing either weapons or manufacturing components for the Israeli military. These companies are making money out of the blood of dead Gazans. That's a fact. That's not perspective. That's not perception. These are just factual reports. The woman gave a factual report. Isn't it ironic that we live in a world where, as I've said, we've now got, a terrorist being feted as the new leader of Syria. He'll be giving speeches in the United Nations, this guy. We've got a war criminal of one of the most heinous states in existence, committing one of the most heinous acts in history, dining with the President of the United States. And we've got a woman being targeted for simply telling the truth. Sanctions themselves are, in effect, considered a breach of human law because they're considered a war crime, because what sanctions do in terms of nations is it's called mass punishment. In other words, if a government does something that another country doesn't like, and this usually particularly case America, then America sanctions the whole country and the populace suffers. So in effect, you're punishing innocents and hurting them. The history of sanctions became a tool of US policy starting in 1990 after the initial, well, it was, if you count the Iran-Iraq war, which we started, it was the second Gulf War, but goes down in history as the first Gulf War, 1990-1991. Now, the United States pressured the United Nations to pose crippling sanctions on Iraq. So after that war finished, you had a country whose sewage, its health system, its sanitary system, its water supply had been devastated because it had been specifically targeted by the coalition forces. Remember our coalition of the killing back then. Now, what happened afterwards were these crippling sanctions were put on, and the United Nations themselves, the United Nations report, not Bintang, not some lefty group, the United Nations said that the result of those sanctions caused the death of 500,000 Iraqi children. Just think of that for a moment. These are these sanctions which we bandy around left, right and centre. Of course, at the time, Madeleine Albright, the US Secretary of State, was interviewed and asked how she felt about the fact that as a result of the sanctions which she had helped impose, 500,000 innocent children had died. Her response, I think the price was worth it. So there you have, the beautiful, free, democratic, peace-loving United States saying that, quite frankly, the death of, well, there are only 500,000 ragheads, weren't they, Madeleine? They didn't really count. They weren't white kids like yours and mine. Disgusting. So sanctions, we talk about sanctions, but we forget, we've become immune to the fact that sanctions are a way of impacting on civilians, on innocent people, on people that have done nothing wrong. And sanctions as such are a form of war crimes. And we need to actually rethink our policy regarding sanctions. The ones against Russia, by the way, are laughable. I always go to the source. So I watch statements, I watch interviews with people like Sergei Lavrov, with Vladimir Putin. I don't listen to what I'm told they say in Western papers. I actually listen to what they say, which are two vastly different things. But what's quite funny is the Russians are laughing. Dmitry Medvedev is mocking us openly because all our sanctions have done is cripple Europe. The Russian economy last year grew at 3.4%. This year it's predicted to grow at 4%. The Russian economy is booming. Russia, in purchasing parity power, has overtaken Germany as Europe's leading economy. How about that? As I mentioned earlier, the American plan to deprive Europe of Russian oil and gas imports, which of course is why we know that the Americans were behind blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline. They sabotaged that so that the Germans couldn't get their cheap gas from Russia. This plan has caused gas prices to soar in Europe. It's caused the deindustrialization of Germany. Many large German firms, because of the massive increase in energy costs, have relocated elsewhere out of Germany, have moved overseas. And where does Europe now get most of its gas from? Well, surprise, surprise, they import it from the United States at massively increased cost. Of course, all counts as long as they don't get it from Russia, and as long as the Russian economy doesn't benefit from it. Russia simply, of course, turned its energy and oil exports to other markets, and now India and China, as we know, import huge amounts of Russian oil and gas. The Indians have been quite adamant. We're not going to change. That's what we're bringing in. And with the formation of the BRICS economic group, which originally started in 2006 with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then later South Africa added to it. This year, of course, earlier this year, Indonesia joined BRICS. BRICS now comprises approximately 40% of the world's population as a trading bloc. Think about that. Think of the economic clout that this group has. BRICS has overtaken the G7 in terms of economic turnover and wealth. And here we are in Australia, hell-bent on clinging to the Americans and the American dollar, which is going down the tubes. BRICS countries all trade in their own currency. They're divesting themselves of the American dollar. Why? Because the Americans have a habit of freezing assets of countries they don't like. This issue where they froze the assets of Afghanistan, another country which their sanctions are destroying, by the way. The Afghani people are starving, and all their money is tied up in America. And America has just frozen it and said, well, we're going to take it. They did the same to Russia. $300 billion worth of Russian assets are held in Western financial markets. Now, the rest of the world is looking at this and going, well, hang on. Do we really want to trade in a currency with the people who can just suddenly freeze our money if they don't like what we do? Once again, stupid foreign policy. As a result, BRICS countries all trade in their own currencies. They're divesting themselves of the American dollar. The US dollar will be crippled eventually. It will have no buying power. And that's going to be a big effect for all of us because, as we know, Donald Trump's big, new, beautiful bill has just increased the US national debt. I remember many years ago, Putin giving a speech, and he said, the one thing facing the world, the one crisis facing the world is not China, it's not North Korea, it's not us, the Russians, it's American debt. Because at some point, that debt level is going to become unsustainable. And when America goes down, we're all going to go down with her. And that's why the BRICS countries are strengthening themselves economically. And to be honest, if Australia had any independent foreign policy, which we don't, but sadly, if we did, we would be looking actually at joining BRICS. It's a much better option than staying in the markets we're in, and we can continue to trade with our largest trading partner, China, rather than antagonise them. Anyway, that's pretty much all from me. A bit of a rambling wrap-up of what's been happening in the week. And of course, Queensland won the State of Origin in a remarkable comeback for those local Australian Rugby League fans. I hope you have a good weekend ahead. And as always, this is Bintang Bernie reminding you there are two kinds of people in this world. Make sure you avoid them both.